Hey guys, tonight we begin with the peculiar, occasionally gruesome, and unintentionally hilarious world of medieval medicine, a time when most doctors were 1 part scholar, 2 parts guesswork, and 3 parts confidence in a very large robe. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You area medieval doctor, and you're feeling extremely qualified, not because you passed a test, not because you trained under an expert, and certainly not because your treatments work, but because you own a long robe, can pronounce phlegmatic, and have a Latin book that you sort of skimmed once during a thunderstorm. You wake up in your timber-framed home just before sunrise. The air smells like damp straw, candle wax, and the vague regret of last night's onion stew. Your mattress is little more than lumpy hay in a bag. You're 30, which in this era means you're respected, seasoned, and one surprise infection away from retirement. You stretch, cough politely into a cloth, and prepare for a full day of healing. A term you use loosely. You didn't own a stethoscope. It hasn't been invented. You don't use soap either. You trust the antiseptic power of incense and judgmental glares. No official credentials hang on your wall, but no one asks. After all, you speak Latin, own 4 entire books, and on Citacler, a man cured after he vomited. In 4 directions. You're basically a miracle worker. You dress carefully, long woolen robes to show you're educated, and a big hat to hide the fact that you don't know what's causing all the boils. You sling your medical bag over your shoulder. It's filled with knives, dried herbs, and the faint hope that no one asks you to explain how kidneys work. Today, like most days, you'll inspect urine, declare people humorally imbalanced, and maybe drain a pint of blood from someone with a toothache. You're not worried? You've done this dozens of times, probably. And if things go badly, you have your fallback excuses. Bad air, sinful behavior, or Mars being in the wrong house again. Worst case, you recommend prayer, and back away slowly. You finish your bread, take a sip of weak ale, safer than the water, and step outside. You're not just a man, you are a healer, a scholar. And absolutely no one needs to know that you once treated a stomachache with mashed garlic and pigeon feathers. Your secret's safe, for now. Your day begins, as all great medical careers do, with a goblet of warm pee. Not yours, of course. That will'd be weird. This one belongs to your first patient, who had the courtesy to deliver it in a clay jar shortly after sunrise. It's still warm. Freshness matters in your line of work. You set eat in the table like a fine wine, and hold it up to the light. What little light you have streaming through your tiny smoke-stained window. You swirl it gently, inhale deeply, and make a thoughtful sound with your mouth that says, "Ah yes, this man is clearly suffering from excess phlegm, and also possibly envy. Welcome to uroscopy, the medieval art of diagnosing illness by examining urine, its color, clarity, scent, thickness, and yes, occasionally taste, are the primary diagnostic tools. Your arsenal. Forget stethoscopes, forget thermometers. You've got 16 shades of yellow, a vague chart from a monastery in Flanders, and an instinct honed by years of pretending to know what you're doing. Clear and pale. That's good. Deep orange. Liver trouble. Murky brown. Probably hot bile or punishment from Mars. Blue. Witchcraft. Definitely witchcraft. If your patient's urine has bubbles in it, that might mean they're about to die. If it doesn't, you might still tell them they're about to die, just to be safe. After all, people appreciate honesty. You might even warm the sample with a candle to wake up the humors, a bit like microwaving soup before serving it. You then record your findings on a little wax tablet and scribble something vaguely Latin fade even, you'll struggle to read later. And when your patient nervously asks what's wrong, You nod wisely, point at the jar, and say something like, "Your collar is inflamed, and your spleen is melancholic. Avoid figs, loud noises, and women named Agnes." You hand them a pouch of herbs, a small talisman, and possibly a leech, and send them on their way, feeling both confused and vaguely reassured, because in the end, what matters isn't curing them, it's sounding like you could if you really wanted to. As a medieval doctor, you don't ask your patient if they've been sleeping, eating properly, or exposed to moldy bread. No, you ask the real questions like, how often have you been visited by black bile this week? Because everyone knows your body is controlled by 4 sacred fluids: blood, phleg, yellow bile, and black bile. It's not about bacteria or viruses or nutrition. That's few. The human body is basically a boiling cauldron of wet medieval soup, and your job is to make sure none of the ingredients are winning. Let's say your patient is angry and flushed, clearly too much blood. The cure: you take some of it out. There. Tired and pale. That's excess phleg. Probably from eating cold foods or talking to someone with low moral character. Yellow bile means dire, irritable, and vomit. Black bile, that one covers just about everything else, including nightmares, melancholia, and poetry. Your entire medical strategy is just advanced plumbing with a moral edge. You adjust the humors with diet, herbs, enemas, vomiting, bleeding, or ideally all of the above. If the body is shet and moist, you recommend cold and dry food, because the answer to internal imbalance is clearly more imbalance. But in the opposite direction, your patient doesn't need logic. They need sage boiled in goat milk while facing east. Of course, no two doctors agree on exactly how much bile is too much, but that's fine. Disagreement makes you sound deeper. You use phrases like humoral disc and temperamental flux to cover any gaps in knowledge. The important thing is to look serene while they panic, and if they die, well, it wasn't your fault. It was their phlegm, or perhaps Saturn, or that sinful lifestyle lead before asking you for help. Either way, you retain your dignity, because in medieval medicine, the humors must be obeyed, even if no one, including you, fully understands what you're doing. It's not about healing, it's about balance, and sounding impressive while recommending mustard plasters for a broken rib. As a medieval doctor, you believe in balance, specifically the balance of humors. And when things feel off, say your patient has a fever, or a headache, or a bad dream, involving pigs, there's only one solution: let the blood out. You don't need a diagnosis. You need a bowl, a blade, and the courage to act before breakfast. The idea is simple. Blood is hot and moist. If someone is too hot, or too moist, or just mildly annoying, a little drainage brings them back to harmony or unconsciousness. Either way, your work is done. You might open a vein in the arm or behind that knee if you're feeling fancy. The neck is reserved for serious cases or especially dramatic flair. And don't worry, you've got a chart from a 12th century monk that tells you which vein corresponds with which organ. It's probably right. He seemed confident. Your patient lies down, arm extended, face pale, though that might just be anticipatory regret. You tie a tight cloth to make the veins swell, say something Latin to sound learned, and make the cut. The blood begins to flow. You nod solemnly. Your assistant faints. You collect the blood in a ceramic bowl. There's no set amount, just enough for the patient to stop complaining or start wobbling. Some doctors claim they can read the illness in the blood's thickness or smell. You mostly pretend you can, too. Occasionally, you swap the blade for a leech if you want something more hands-free and significantly more wriggly. Leeches are quiet, reusable, and always hungry. They're also excellent listeners. When it's over, you'll wrap the arm, offer some weak ale, and advise rest. Not too much though. Sloth increases phlegm. If the patient walks away, you declare them improved. If they pass out, successfully purged. If they die, too late to treat. Because in your world, bloodletting isn't just a cure, it's a lifestyle. And you haven't even had your turnip porridge yet. You finish your morning bloodletting routine, wipe your hands on your robe, or the nearest apprentice, and prepare for the day's real opportunity, house calls. Specifically the homes of those who can afford things like walls, servants, and not dying. Peasants are fine for practice, but they tend to pay in chickens, labor, or a tearful thank you. Noble families, on the other hand, pay in coin, compliments, and occasionally awkward invitations to dinner where someone is visibly dying at the table. You pack your bag, leeches, ointments, sores, and a collection of dried herbs that all smell vaguely of hay and sadness. You make sure your hat is tight. Your robe is heavy. This isn't just about healing. It's about presence. Up in Herbal at the manor, you're greeted by a servant who clearly distrusts you, but says nothing because you're wearing velvet and carrying a bag of knives. The air smells like beeswax, damp stone, and boiled something. A woman faints in the hallway. No one mentions it. Your patient is lying in a 4-poster bed, surrounded by tapestries and anxious relatives. They've got a fever, a swollen foot, and an overwhelming belief that you're about to fix it with whatever's in that jar. You ask the usual questions. What have they eaten? How often have they bathed? Never. Has Mercury recently crossed paths with Saturn? Then you look wisely into the fire for a full 5 seconds before announcing it's an imbalance of the humors, probably bile. Definitely not demonic, unless the symptoms worsen on Sundays. You recommend something authoritative, a puss of crushed mint and powdered snail shell. Perhaps you tell them to avoid cold wind, red meat, or thinking too hard. You prescribe bed rest, which they're already doing spectacularly. Before you leave, Thelody of the house presses coins into your hand, hoping you're worth more than the priest who came by last week and just sprinkled everything with holy water and left. You nod solemnly, promise to return and remind them. If swelling moves upward, send for you immediately. If it moves downward, send for the priest. You call it a medical bag. Everyone else calls it a reason tofli. Your satchel is heavy, not with hope or healing, but with an alarming collection of objects that wouldn't look out of place in a dungeon. And yet, this is your daily carry, your medieval doctor's kit, your pride and joy, your portable cabinet of please hold still. You open it up before each visit like a magician, revealing his tricks. Inside, a terrifying blend of sharp, rusty, vaguely holy, and deeply unhygienic. First your knives, not scalpels, just honest-to-God knives. Sharp enough to pin skin, not sharp enough to inspire confidence. One's for cutting, one's for draining, and one you use to spread soft cheese during lunch. They all look the same. Then there are the hooks for pulling out infected teeth, or dislodging things that aren't supposed to be there. You've got sores for amputations, cautery irons for closing wounds with fire, and attrapping skulls when someone gets a hit of shaythits, clearly the result of spirits trapped in the brain. You carry leeches, of course, stored in a small jar, wriggling with enthusiasm. Each one has a name. You try not to get attached. In a smaller pouch, you keep your ointments and powders, crushed herbs, dried lizard tails, ground antler, maybe some questionable stones someone swore cured stomach ailments. You haven't bothered labeling anything. It's more fun, togus. There's also a urine flask used for diagnosis, and sometimes as a paperweight when the wind picks up your notes. And let's not forget the astrological wheel for determining whether Venus is ruining your patient's spleen. Bandages, rare, soap, theoretical, clean water, huh? You wrap it all in a cloth that hasn't been washed since the last plague and hope no. One asks why the blade has dried blood on it. Relic of Saint Sebastian, you explain. They nod in reverence. You both move on. And somehow this bag, this terrifying, clanging, possibly cursed object, give us authority. You walk into a room, open it, and people assume you know exactly what you're doing, which in a way you do. You're doing your best, just net, with gloves. You walk into the sick room, take one look at the pale, sweaty nobleman lying on the bed, and immediately consult the most logical source of medical guidance, the sky. That's right. You're not just a doctor. You're a celestial crafter of human suffering. And in your world, no diagnosis is complete without confirming whether Saturn is in opposition or if Jupiter is being particularly judged. You reach for your trusty zodiac chart covered in symbols that would terrify a modern science teacher. Aries governs the head, Pisces rules the feet, and everything in between is divided neatly across the horoscope like a medieval game board. If the patient's stomach hurts and the moon is in Virgo, that's clearly a bad omen. Not for you, for them. You nod slowly, dramatically. The patient watches wide-eyed as you mutter about Mercury retrograding near their liver. The stars, you explain, control the flow of humors in the body. Mars causes fevers, Saturn cosmolanchally. Venus, that one causes inappropriate swelling and awkward family drama. Timing matters. You wouldn't dare perform bloodletting while the moon is waxing. Everyone knows that's how you get spontaneous fainting and marital problems. And God forbid, someone gives birth during a solar eclipse. That's practically begging for the child to grow up with a limp and strong opinions. Patients rarely question this system. After all, it sounds smart, and it gives them something vague to blame their ailments on. Like Mars being angry instead of you licked moldy bread again, you sometimes chart their personal horoscope just to pad the consultation. Birth hour, rising, sign, position of the moon, when they first sneezed, 3 days ago. All crucial data points in determining their shoulder is full of hot bile, and when your diagnosis is complete, you deliver it with reverence. Your phlegm ishivy, because Venus is damp this week. No one knows what that means, least of all you. But they nod, they pay, they thank you for your insight. And off you go, celestial wizard of the Leeches, ready to heal more souls, with nothing but a compass, a candle, and the misplaced trust of the ill. Your abuto cut a man open with a knife. You also use 2 sliced cheese. Everything is going to be just fine. It's surgery day. Not because the moon is right or the patient's humors are calm, but because the swelling has started to smell like cooked onions, and someone finally screamed loud enough to get your attention. You lay out your tools, a dull knife, a bone saw, a rag, soaked in wine, and something vaguely shaped like a jidge. There is no anesthesia. The patient gets 2 things, a cup fail, and the advice to bite something wooden and think about nice memories. You reassure him with a warm smile, and a phrase like, "This may sting a little." It won't. It will sting a lot. Yalbagin cutting. There's yelling, there's shaking. At some point, someone passes out. Hopefully, it's not you. Your assistant holds the patient down while also looking like he'd rather be apprenticing to a baker or a corpse. The wound opens, and you do what every medieval surgeon does. Poke around confidently and hope for guidance. You might remove infected flesh, drain some mysterious pus, or yank out a rotten tooth with something that looks like garden shears. You're not too worried about germs. You don't know. They exist. You believe infection comes from bad air, or perhaps moral weakness. Either way, your tools haven't been cleaned since the last procedure, which was on a goat. Maybe you didn't ask. Once the job is done, you pour Winnie in the wound for cleansing and theatrics, then seal it with hot iron or spiderweb soaked in oil, both of which are medically questionable, but sound impressive. You'll wrap it in linen and tell the patient to rest. He'll either recover miraculously or die in 2 days. Either way, you did your part. And if a known criticizes your work, you point out that Galen once removed a gladiator's spleen with a bronze hook, and he is still considered a genius. Because in your world, surgery isn't about success. It's about confidence, speed, and the patient screaming slightly less than usual. When in doubt, slap a leech on it, or several, or a dozen, depending on how serious you want to look. You've tried prayers. You've tried herbs. You've even tried slicing into people with the delicacy of a butcher on market day. But nothing screams professional medicine quite like applying live worms to a human body and nodding like you understand what you're doing. Leeches are your go-to remedy. The Swiss Army knife of medieval healthcare. Fever, leech. Headache, leech. Swollen ankle, broken heart, mysterious ghost-related trembling. Leech, leech, and leech. You carry them in a small jar, or as you call it, the squirming chalice of miracles. They're kept damp, moody, and well-fed, hopefully, not too whelped. No one likes a lazy leech. The patient, of course, is skeptical. They see a slimy black worm, and assume you're mad. But you assure them this is a refined and ancient practice used by learned men in fine robes. You don't mention that some Aftos men were monks guessing wildly, or barbers just trying to distract clients from the smell of boiled socks. You select a healthy-looking leech, plump, energetic, eager for blood, like a tiny gothic vampire. You apply it to the skin, often behind the ear or on a veiny bit of forearm, and wait. If it latches in quickly, you smile and say, "Ah, yes." The leech agrees with your imbalance. If it doesn't, you mutter something about Mercury being in retrograde and try again. Soon, the leech swells with blood. Your patient turns pale. You pretend this is entirely normal. You say things like, "He's drawing out the toxins," or "Your bile was misbehaving." Once the leech is full, you remove it with salt or vinegar. Or if you're feeling cruel, you just let it drop off on its own, dramatically bloated and deeply satisfied. The patient, dizzy and concerned, asks if they're cured. We've taken a promising first step. Translation: you have no idea, but the leech looks pleased. And sometimes that's enough to keep everyone believing in the magic, because in Thamed, the best thing about leeches is that they do all the work and they never ask for payment. As a medieval doctor, your understanding of the human mind is, let's say, interpretive. You've got no psychology degree, no neuroscience, and absolutely no interest in understanding long-term effects of stress. What you do have is a solid belief that if Somione's behavior is unusual, it's either sinful, supernatural, or both. Your first patient of the day is a woman who hasn't spoken in 2 weeks. She stares at walls, occasionally hums Andens through a spoon at her husband's cousin. In your book, this can only mean known thing, possessed by spirits, possibly plural. You perform your standard diagnostic ritual. Ask the priest if he's available, sprinkle some holy water, and light a candle that smells vaguely of despair and goat fat. Then, with the utmost seriousness, you tell her family that she's been overtaken by melancholy, caused by annexus of black bile, or a minor demon named Gregory. Of course, melancholia is the catch-all diagnosis for sadness, anxiety, introversion, poetry, and any woman who reads too much. Your treatment options include herbal compresses, bleeding, forced prayer, or if things get really spicy, an exorcism. For the truly mad, there's always the monastery, the local madhouse, which is just a glorified barn with a padlock and some hay. Their patients are often treated with cold baths, whipping and shouted scripture. The theory is simple. If their mind is broken, scare it back into place. Some doctors dabble in trepanation, drilling holes into the skull to release the spirits. You haven't tried it yourself, but you nod respectfully when others mention it. Bold move. Women, of course, get special attention. If one's too emotional, she's got hysteria caused by her womb wandering around the body, like a bored house cat. You recommend calming herbs, a cold compress, and for her to stop thinking so much, possibly marriage, possibly a pilgrimage. If the patient improves, divine blessing. If they don't, God's will. Either way, your conscience is clear. Because in your mental illness isn't a condition, it's a cosmic inconvenience. And your job isn't to understand it, it's to survive it without catching it. You strut into town with your tall hate and your Latin phrases, fresh from draining a nobleman's elbow. You air without a doubt the smartest man alive, or at least within walking distance. Button, disaster strikes. Your patient is also seeing an apothecary. How derathy. Apothecaries are the medieval equivalent of pharmacists, but with more assists and fewer regulations. They grind herbs, boil roots, mix mysterious bastes, and somehow actually help people, which is frankly infuriating. They don't quote Aristotle. They don't carry charts of planetary alignment. They just hand out medicine that smells like regret and actually does something. You, however, are a university-trained physician, or at least you own a book that says so. You don't stoop to me like measuring powders or boiling bark. Your job is to point at the stars, talk about bile, and prescribe vague ideas. Let the apothecary figure out what a cooling tonic with lunar influence even means. Still, patients often trust them. After all, apothecaries live in town, know everyone's secrets, and haven't tacitly bled someone to death this week. Their shops smell of thyme and honey, not singed bandages and clove oil despair. The rivalry is fierce. You think they're meddling herbalists. They think you're an overpaid robe with a gut complex. You accuse them of poisoning the sick with folk remedies. They accuse you of charging for silver coins to mutter. Your spleen is rebellious. Sometimes you team up begrudgingly. A treatment so vague, it's basically a vibe, and they concoct something that might help but definitely won't kill. If the patient recovers, you take the credit. If not, you quietly imply. The apothecary didn't boil the mandra root long enough. Of course, neither of you truly wins. The patient ends up poorer. The town gets another health rumor. And the local priest claims it was divine intervention, alalong. But at least you maintained your dignity. Because in medieval medicine, you don't need to be effective. You just need to be louder, richer, and slightly more terrifying than your competition. You don't need to know how plants work, just which ones make patients slightly less loud. You're a medieval doctor, which means you are an expert in herbs by default, mostly because everyone assumes you are. After all, you own a book with faded ink drawings of plants, some dried leaves in a pouch, and the confidence of a man who once told Samin to eat sage for a leg wound. Today's patient arrives with an issue described as inner churning, which could mean stomach cramps, heartbreak, or possibly demonic influence. You rummage through your sack of mystery flora and decide confidently that valerian root should do the trick. Why? Because it smells strong and makes people sleepy. Two reliable signs that it's doing something. You also keep a stash of which you prescribe for digestion, fleas, and people who annoy you. There's nettle for pain, mallow for inflammation, and mandra, which you only use when you want to look mysterious. It's mildly poisonous, wildly expensive, and vaguely shaped like a person. Perfect for impressing the illiterate. The truth is, you don't really know what each herb does, and neither does anyone else. You go by tradition, vague anecdotes, and whatever. The monk down the road swears cured his cousin's goat. You grind, boil, and mash with enthusiasm, all while reciting Latin words to make it feel official. Sometimes you add honey, not for medicinal reasons, just because everything tastes like wet soil otherwise, and patients complain less. Their spleen tonic doesn't taste like punishment. If the remedy works, you nod solemnly and say, the fever has yielded to the herb's cool nature. If it doesn't, you blame the patient for not believing hard enough. And when desperate, you mix several herbs together and pray one of them cancels out the others. It's a bit like gambling, but with more vomiting. You also insist on foraging your own ingredients when possible because wild herbs are clearly stronger, or at least dirtier, which adds to the rustic charm. In the end, you're herbal, Cures are 30% tradition, 20% guesswork, and 50% bluffing. But hey, at least they don't scream when you hand them a cup of tea, no matter how much leeching, bleeding, or herb mashing you do. You are never truly alone in your medical career, because the church is always lurking like a very concerned parent, or a nosy neighbor who just happens to control your entire worldview and political structure. Your patient has a fever. You can try a pus, but first you should probably check if they've confessed their sins. Coughing up blood sounds like divine punishment. Best send for the priest before you even think about opening your apothecaric. Healing is fine, as long as you don't outshine God. You've been warned before. That one time you cured a nobleman's gout with vinegar and hot rocks. People said it bordered on sorcery. That time you suggested the stars might influence digestion, adjacent. And when you briefly considered experimenting with cadaver dissection, you might as well have a suggested talking to trees. Of course, the church has its own ideas about healing, namely prayer, relics, and occasionally touching bones wrapped in gold. You don't argue. You just sigh quietly and make room for the priest to sprinkle holy water on your patient while you stand there holding a jar of mashed garlic and shame. Sometimes you team up. You provide the earthly treatment, and the priest provides the heavenly reassurance. If the patient gets better, it's a miracle. If they don't, well, God's mysterious will. And maybe you need more incense. You've learned to work around it. You begin your treatments with a quick "May God guide my blade," and end with a firm "Amen." Just in case someone's listening, you also keep a small crucifix in your bag, not for healing, but for warding off suspicion when someone accuses you of thinking too much. You are, after all, a man of science, a vague, squishy, blood-soaked version of science, but still, just not the kind that questions the church. If the limb is rotting, infected, or just generally upsetting to look at, why not remove it? It's the medieval way. You've bled, you've purged, you've leeched, you even tried praying near the patient while waving a handful of thyme, and still, the leg looks worse than a loaf of bread left in the rain for 3 weeks. That's when you know it's time to amputate. You don't take this decision lightly, mostly because it's heavy work and you skipped breakfast. But when the wound is black, the smell is unnatural, and the patient's groans have turned into ominous silence, you sharpen the saw. The setup is simple. You find the patient a sturdy table and a strong friend to hold them down. An assistant fetches the amputation kit, 1 saw, 1 tourniquet, 1 rag to bite, and 1 large jug of fale, for medicinal purposes, not for the patient, for you. You explain the procedure gently, using words like necessary, heroic, and possible. The patient turns pale. You nod understandingly. You would be nervous too if someone with your level of training were coming at your thigh with a glorified bread knife. You tie the tourniquet tight, say something about balance and humors, just for show, and start cutting. Slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. Once the screaming hits full volume, the saw bites through skin, fat, muscle, and eventually bone. You pretend not to see. You're a professional. Once it's off, you toss the limb into a nearby bucket and immediately cauterize the stump with a red-hot iron. The smell is unforgettable. You blame the candle wax. Then comes bandaging. You wrap the wound tightly with linen and a silent hope that infection won't set in by sundown. You advise the patient to rest, avoid cold wind, and if possible, not die. If they survive, you are a miracle worker. If they don't, you solemnly declare that corruption had spread to the soul. In truth, it's a brutal procedure, but sometimes amputation is the only way to save a life, or at least slightly deliberate, while maintaining your professional reputation. You hear coughing in the distance. Tomato, go home and pretend you didn't. It's been a long day. You've drained blood, argued with apothecaries, applied leeches to at least 3 confused people, and removed 1 leg with the grace of a drunken carpenter. You're ready to call it a night. But then you hear it, a rattle, a wheeze, a cough that sounds like it crawled out of the underworld. You freeze. Your apprentice freezes. Even the leeches seem tense. There's only one possible explanation. The plague is back. You've seen it before. The swelling, the black blotches, the smell of onions, and doom. You remember the last time it swept through. Your barber surgeon friend left town in a wagon, and your favorite baker simply stopped existing. You reach for your mask, not because it works, but because it makes you feel better. It's filled with dried flowers, vinegar-soaked cloth, and misplaced confidence. You don't understand disease transmission, but you do understand that if the sick people come too close, you mysteriously stop being a doctor. You pack your tools quickly. There's no time for farewells. You mutter something about lunar interference and fasting as you back away from the village. The thing is, medieval medicine has no real answer for plague. You can't bleed it out. You can't pus it. And you definitely can't chant it into submission. Your treatments range from burning herbs to lighting entire neighborhoods on fire. One of those occasionally works. You consider writing down your findings, but decide against it. You'd rather not be remembered for suggesting garlic water as a cure for the end of humanity. Instead, you head for the countryside, maybe visit a monastery, maybe take up winemaking. Anything that doesn't involve open source and deeply suspicious groaning. Because, as a medieval doctor, you know when to treat, and more importantly, you know when to disappear. The leeches wriggle in agreement. The stars say it's time, and your robe smells like burned basil and regret. You vanish into the mist like a medical magician with no answers. And the townsfolk, they'll say, he did everything he could, which is technically true. He just did it from far away. Imagine walking into a grand medieval cathedral. Stone columns rise like trees, incense fills the air, and stained glass windows scatter divine light across the pews. Normally, you'd expect solemn monks chanting Latin prayers and bishops draped in regal vestments, but not today. Today, there's a man up front in a bishop's mitre, and he's drunk. His robes are backward, his foes is smeared with ash, and he just blessed the crowd by sticking out his tongue and mooning the altar. Welcome to the Feast of Fools, one of the most outrageous spectacles ever tolerated by the medieval church, held every year around the New Year, particularly in France. The Feast of Fools was a sanctioned explosion of disorder. The idea was simple. Take the most rigid institution in medieval Europe, the church, and turn it inside out for a day. Choir boys dressed as clergy. The low-ranking deacons elected a fool bishop or lord of misrule. who presided over mock masses filled with parody, flatulence, and sometimes literal barnyard animals. Imagine the janitor becoming CEO for 24 hours and doing everything backward, blindfolded, and wasted. That's the level of absurdity we're talking about. But here's the wildest part. The church didn't just allow this. They hosted it. In fact, the festivities were often organized by cathedral chapters themselves. Why? Because the rigid social hierarchy needed a pressure valve. Life in medieval France was suffocating. Peasants obeyed landlords, clergy obeyed bishops, and everyone obeyed God. Or else the Feast of Fools was their one legal chance to scream, laugh, and mock everything that oppressed them. It was like Mardi Gras, an exorcism. Participants paraded through the streets, wearing masks, playing lutes, singing lewd songs, and shouting blasphemies with the gleeful immunity of jesters. Sometimes they even rode donkeys into churches. Holy water was replaced with wine. Sermons were rewritten as bawdy poems. The air smelled of ale and candle wax and chaos. But it wasn't just silly fun. It was social satire in disguise. These knew exactly who they were mocking. The elites who ruled them from ivory towers and golden thrones. And for just one day, the joke was finally on them. The result? Holy anarchy sung in perfect choir boy harmony. Every kingdom needs a ruler, even one built on chaos. And during the Feast of Fools, that ruler wasn't a king, bishop, or baron. It was the Lord of Misrule, a crown-wearing court jester elected from the lowest ranks of the clergy, or sometimes even the town's most absurd drunkard. Picture this: a gangly teenager from the cathedral choir, barely able to grow a beard, is suddenly paraded through town on a makeshift throne made of beer barrels. He's wearing oversized bishop robes, a mitre crafted from pigkin, and he blesses the crowd by flinging cabbage at them. This is no joke. This was tradition. The Lord of Misrule was the living embodiment of reversal. Everything serious became far, everything sacred, profane. He would oversee fake processions, reverse rituals, and outrageous parodies of Christian rites. The gospel was read backward. Incense was replaced with smoke from burnt shoes. And in place of holy chants, participants howled, snorted, and even meowed like cats. The people loved it. He had full command over the town for the day, leading mock ceremonies and satirical sermons that would make a modern-day stand-up comic. His court included other clowns, jugglers, and disorderly clergy who may or may not have been completely sober. They handed out fake indulgences, held drunken trials, and sometimes staged mock excommunications of authority figures, all with roaring applause. What made this dangerous and thrilling was how close it danced to blasphemy. But that was the point. This wasn't mindless chaos. It was targeted rebellion wearing the mask of fun. In fact, the choice of a Laurenking youth or peasant as the ruler wasn't accidental. It was a satirical jab at the divine right of kings and the sanctity of bishops. By electing someone absurd, the people weren't just laughing, they were. How ridiculous the real power structures could be. If a choir boy could wear the robes and mimic Thiesermans, how divine were they really? Church authorities often tried to suppress Thief Stival's worst excesses, but never quite succeeded. The Lord of Misrule kept returning year after year, drunker and louder than ever. Because as long as society had rigid rules, the people would crave a day to break them. You walk into a cathedral expecting solemn hymns and stern faces. Instead, you're greeted by a man in a donkey mask braying from the pulpit while a half-naked monk juggles communion wafers in the aisle. Welcome to the heart of the Feast of Fools, where the sacred space became a stage and no line was too bold to cross. During the height of the festival, actual church interiors, those awe-inspiring, echoing vaults, were overtaken by rockers' parody. Not just outside, in the town square, but right inside the belly of Christendom. The choir boys danced. The canons shouted obscene jokes. Processions fitted participants dressed as women, animals, and even demons. It was Divinity Theater in full collapse. But the most iconic spectacle, the ass mass, where a donkey was led into the cathedral, allowed to brawl yacky moments in the service, and sometimes even answered the priest's lines. At the conclusion, instead of amen, the congregation would cry, hey ha, in perfect unison. It sounds absurd, because it was. But these acts had a biting undertone. They weren't just mocking the rituals. They were mocking the rigidity, hypocrisy, and self-importance of that church's hierarchy. The people knew the rules, and that's what made breaking them so satisfying. Priests and bishops were often torn. Some leaned into the joke, allowing the madness to play out in hopes it would burn itself out. Others were furious, trying desperately to stamp it out, condemning it as heretical and indecent. Papal bulls were issued. Bishops wrote angry letters, and laws were passed to restrict the abuses. And yet, it kept happening. Why? Because the cathedral wasn't just a holy place. It was the beating heart of the town, the one place everyone had to take seriously every other day of the year. Turning it into a carnival ground wasn't just fun. It was liberation for one wild day. The stone walls that symbolized divine authority became the backdrop for fart jokes and beer-soaked pageantry. Even the clergy couldn't help but laugh sometimes, because when your daily life is drenched in fear of sin, confession, and eternal damnation, the chance to brave like a donkey in God's house, that's priceless. What makes a joke funny in medieval France? Dressing up like a bishop and performing a mock exorcism on cheese, or preaching a sermon in gibberish Latin while wearing underpants on your head. During the Feast of Fools, humor wasn't just encouraged, it was weaponized, and its sharpest target. The very rituals that held society together. The parody was surgical. Participants knew the Mass by heart. They had to. After all, most of the performers were subdeacons, minor clergy, or choir boys. That meant they understood the liturgy well enough to twist it. The result was absurd, blasphemous, and hilariously accurate. They mimicked prayers with crude rhymes, turned psalms into drinking songs, and delivered sermons that praised gluttony, lust, or the holiness of wine. These weren't just jokes for the sake of laughter. They were thinly veiled commentaries on the growing disconnect between the clergy and the people. When a parody mass swapped incense for manure smoke, it wasn't just for shock, it was a critique. One notorious example involved a fake blessing of sausages during a mock Lent, complete with solemn chants and holy gestures. In another, a faux bishop blessed the crowd while urinating in a bucket hidden beneath his robes. Offensive, yes, but it made a point. If church claimed spiritual superiority, but indulged in earthly vices, why not